Welcome to How to Roundtable Talks episode 2, presented by #Merky Books and Beats by Dre. With me, I have Anthony Anaxagorou, author of How to Write It, singer-songwriter Joy Crookes, and best-selling author of Love in Colour, Bolu Babalola. Hello, everyone.
Hi,
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to episode 2. Right, let's start with the book. I'd love to know from you, Anthony, how did you come up with the idea?
I think it was more just thinking that I didn't want to write a step-by-step guide. So I wanted it to be a little bit more interesting and kind of personal, that documents a journey into poetry and into literature, but also imparts a series of kind of tips and musings on things to do with the craft of writing, but also how you get things published and looking at the more practical side of things as well. So I wanted to kind of fuse my journey with tips and advice and then reflections on language, going from language philosophy all the way through to the way in which we as readers respond to ideas in books. So covering as much ground as I could. Then with the finished product, what do you do? How do you get an agent? How do you get it to a publisher? How do you work with an editor? So all that I wanted to cover as well, while still using my journey as a springboard.
How hard is it, though, to write a book about writing a book?
Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing. Like, it doesn't exist. Like, there is no one way to do anything. So essentialism that's not what the book is about. It's about finding a series of different ways in which you can approach a subject and thinking about it in that way.
Well, I'm going to talk to you guys about your different styles of writing, of course, sort of writing for music, writing books and how you write. But I'd love to know about the start of your journeys into writing with what you read. So, Bolu, what did you read when you were young that sort of informed the writer that you became?
I think I naturally gravitated towards romance. I think I've always been really drawn to the hope and the joy within romance. I really got into black rom-coms, American rom-coms. The idea for creating my own kind of versions of romance began percolating in my mind. How can I write about us in this kind of space that's so full of hope and joy and softness? Because I never really saw that, never really read that in our context.
What was it for you, Joy, that will it have been music in terms of songwriting that you listened to early on that informed the songwriter that you became?
I read books. I was a particular reader. I feel like I felt quite forced to read books, and then I'd get into a book and I wouldn't let go of it, and then I wouldn't read a book for 6 months. But I remember there was a time in like year 6 when I was like 11 or 12 and I'd bought a bunch of books. I bought like Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I was reading like Sylvia Plath, which was quite dark. And
wow.
Then, yeah, like old Irish poetry as well, because my dad's Irish, and like Philip Larkin type poetry. And I spent a lot of time by myself, like my whole life. I've always been quite on my own. I think isolation makes you engage with your subconscious, and before you know it, you're thinking of a quote that you read, or you're thinking about that one tiny thing. And then words start to formulate and stories start to formulate. And I don't know, for me, it's not just other people's readings, it's conversation, it's what people wear, it's the way they smell. And then what my subconscious mind does in my own time.
That was deep. I thought you were going to be like, yeah, Roald Dahl.
Jacqueline Wilson.
Yeah. I'm just like, yeah. Anthony, what about you? Was there like something from your childhood that you read that informed the writer that you became?
Not really. I didn't read books as a kid, which is quite interesting. Part of it is a class issue, in that I came from a background where reading wasn't encouraged. Not that it came with shame, but it was one of these things where you were kind of ridiculed a little bit. Oh, look at this guy, thinks he's smart reading a book. And I kind of picked it up when I was 21, 22, but then I became obsessed. Then I read everything, like everything from the classics to very difficult kind of Nietzschean philosophy to Plato to kind of Socrates, so the classics, and then through to like history, poetry, the classic books, literature, like anything I can get my hands on for 10 years, I just read.
I love that you just didn't read as a child and then went Plato.
Yeah, just straight in. And obviously,
that's where I'm going to start.
Yeah, but reading Plato at 19, 20 with no context is difficult. Like, that's why an institution to help intellectually frame what it is that you're reading really does help.
I'd love to talk about how you guys approach writing. Bolu, Love in Colour, incredibly received, bestseller. How do you approach the writing process, or how did you approach that writing process?
Love in Colour is very particular because obviously it's based on mythology from around the world and folklore from around the world. So obviously I took a while to research. And so you have this kind of mass of content, stories about creation, stories about war, what could be romance. And then once I figured that out, it was a case of, okay, how do I take out the misogyny and the patriarchy? And then it was a case of discovering who my characters were. And sometimes I would write a whole story, really, really full, really, really rich, be like, okay, now I'm going to scrap this and start all over again. Because for me, it was about discovering who my characters are and what they're saying to me and what their personalities are. Because it's a romance, I figured out their romance is centered on the women. So I would figure out who the woman is and then kind of go from there and think who would complement her, who would embrace her, who would elevate her, what's the right partner for her, and how can I bring him or her alive.
Wow. So you had to genuinely create this world.
Yeah, it was a lot of world building. Sometimes I would write a whole saga just to take it out because I needed that to situate myself in the world that I'm creating and I'm living within for the next few pages.
And how do you approach writing just from a technical perspective? Did you find there were particular circumstances that helped you write, or you needed a particular set of circumstances in order for the ideas to flow?
It's really important to let yourself breathe and let your mind breathe. So I would figure out the story, and then sometimes I would just sit on it for a day, and I wouldn't even think about it, and I would listen to my favorite songs, love songs, and I would watch my favorite movies. And then next day, you're almost subconsciously, like you said, Joy, soaking up all this inspiration, and then it flows easier. When I was a lot younger, I used to put a lot of my pressure on myself and a blank page to force the story out. I think it's good to sit on it, situate yourself in that world, and let it come to you.
Joy, what about you with writing songs? Are there circumstances that you kind of need in order to get a song out?
I think there are. But I constantly prove myself wrong. I don't know if you guys are guilty of this, but do you ever write something amazing and then you go, it's because it was raining outside, it's because I had a black coffee that morning instead of with milk.
And you try to recreate it.
Yeah, and you literally try everything to recreate it. It got to a point once where I was vocaling, I vocaled a song, and to get myself in the right headspace, I messaged my ex and just was chatting with them and then got into the
Just for the song?
Yeah. Because I'm maybe I need to be in this headspace. But to be honest with you, I think I don't believe in the whole you have to be a suffering artist. I don't think that's a real thing. I think actually the common trait I notice with when I write my best songs is that I'm not actually overthinking or thinking very much when I write them. I found what you said so amazing because you let your character speak to you. And that sounds almost spiritual because when I write my best songs, I don't know I'm writing one of my best songs. The song comes out of me.
Yeah.
Some weird idea that's been in the air and just wants a vessel comes out of me into the page. And not to say that I have nothing to do with it, but it genuinely feels that way. I've written songs in 10 minutes that have people sing back to me, and that's unbelievable. And when I try and recreate that environment, it doesn't work. And I just have to not overthink. And I'm very practical. I think I need to have a routine, and I think my mind needs to be stable for me to get into a place when I'm not overthinking.
So it almost needs to be unintentional when you're writing it?
Basically, yeah.
Anthony, what about you? Is there anything that particularly inspires you or just gets you in that headspace?
I can't do formulas. So I'm the opposite. I can't, if I've done something once, I never want to do it again. I write 7-8 hours in a day, and to the point where your brain, by the 6th, 7th hour, your brain's done. It's done. I can spend a day on 2 lines, just tinkering with 2 lines, and it's reworking things. So the process, the analytical process and the interrogation of lines, I think takes a lot more for me. But I work across several notebooks. And so when I'm not at a desk, I'll have a notebook that just has random stuff in it. So it'll be something like, I might be in a shop and hear a couple arguing or hear a conversation, and one of the lines sounds quite interesting. I told you that yesterday. And I told you that yesterday. And I'll write that down in the notebook and then start a poem with, I told you that yesterday. And it's about seeing where you can go from not knowing. So I write not knowing where I'm going to end up, with the idea that I learn something when I get to the end of the road that I didn't know before.
Yeah, I need to start thinking like that. I do have one of them scrap kind of like anything I hear, but that is, yeah. It's good to not ever want to repeat a formula.
Yeah, never.
That's my problem.
That's the antithesis, I think, of creativity.
Yeah.
Once you're in a formula, you're not creating.
No.
So there's
It
not
becomes
art.
a science
There's no
rather than
innovation.
art.
Yeah.
Writing is quite solitary. So how do you deal with that moment as a writer when you allow somebody in? So for songwriting, it may be an A&R. When you write a book, it may be a publisher. When you're dealing with somebody else's opinion of what you've written, how do you navigate that, Bolu?
Well, you really, really have to trust the person you're working with. Like me and my editor for Love and Colour are now best friends. And we honestly almost had to become that because I need to trust her implicitly, but also she needs to get me and know what the stories that I'm trying to tell and who I am. And so when you have somebody who knows you and knows your spirit and knows what you're trying to create, there aren't any battles like that make you kind of get your back up and think that somebody's trying to take over your creation. It becomes more of a conversation. When they know you, they know what you're capable of. And if they know what you're trying to say, they can be like, is this the best way to say what you're trying to say? Sometimes it just takes that. And then I'll look at the sentence again, and maybe I say, no, it is. But sometimes that question itself alone is enough to make me be like, actually, no. And also, I don't like this bit. And then do something completely different and also much, much better. So I think you need somebody who you trust implicitly and also who knows you really, really well.
Do you work with anyone like that where you allow them to have a say in your art, in your writing, or do you feel like you have to be in a completely solitary space to write?
It's really hard with music because you've got the words, you've also got melodies. Someone might say something about the words but not realise that if you're changing the words, you have to fit a certain amount of words into that melody. I really believe in melodies. I think there are times where your words are accentuated by your melody. And I like being questioned. I like when someone challenges me. I don't like being told necessarily what to do. I like being challenged. It's really different. One of the best experiences I've had with my writing is when I worked with a woman called Audra May, and she sat me down, we were in the studio, and she just asked me lots of questions. And it went from being quite trivial to being quite personal before I knew it. And then, she gets up, she's like, it's 12 o'clock, I'm gonna go have a glass of wine, and you've just written a song by everything you just said. And the song kind of just fell out. She allowed me to be Joy, and she knew what her part in that was. And when she came back in, she just asked a couple of questions, small lines changed. And like you said, she's one of the most important people in my life now.
I think knowing their part, like you said, is so important.
Yeah.
Knowing that you are the creator.
Yeah.
They're just there to help you kind of guide and maybe trigger things. So important. It has to be a conversation.
Also because, I don't want to speak on behalf of your experience, but I think because there's such a lack of people like myself in the music industry, people of South Asian descent, women, full stop, that I don't like people trying to talk on behalf of me. I have to tell my own story. So I have that I need to have that protection and be really careful with who I let in to challenge that. Because my issue is I get bad anxiety from if someone says the wrong thing, and not necessarily if they insult me. But I think sometimes too high a compliment is too low an insult. And if someone compliments you too much in a space where you're trusting them with your music or with your writing, it can be just as detrimental as someone saying it's shit, you know? And I started in this really young, so I've been like damaged by people's comments, and I've had to really learn how to protect myself and what I do.
Do you know what? This leads me to something that, again, I didn't actually think I was going to be talking about, but criticism with writing.
I think going off of what Joy said, I think it's really, really important to spend time getting to know your voice and trusting your voice and trusting your mission and your vision because, for instance, not this project, but another project, I got feedback from somebody and they mentioned something about my main character. They said she's arrogant. Now, the person who said this is a white woman. My character is a dark-skinned black woman. And so I know my voice, I know what I'm trying to say. This dark-skinned black woman is confident. And I think it's really, really important for women everywhere, especially black women, especially dark-skinned black women, to see a young black woman, to see themselves represented and see themselves confident as well in themselves, not mired within pain or insecurity that's kind of tethered to their skin color and who they are. And so for me, her saying she was arrogant was an aggression, and not even a microaggression, it was just aggressive. That was something that I was sure of. Even though I hadn't got a book deal at that point, I was still quite green. I knew myself enough to push back on that, and I think that's so important, to be able to see criticism and know where it's coming from somewhere that's actually trying to build you up and be constructive, versus when it's something that is destructive, actually.
Now, Anthony, obviously you talk about how to write. Part of that is how to kind of deal with outside opinions. What is your advice to people that need to navigate that, what Bolu calls feedback?
It's a difficult one because it's an occupational hazard. It's what you do. You know, like you make work to be read and to be received. What happens once it's left you has got nothing to do with you. You have no control over it. That's why we make art. You make art for it to be consumed, to be thought about, to be contemplated and re-rendered. I've read reviews online that I've just been like, cool. Someone reviewed my latest poetry book and said, I don't like this because it had too many line breaks. What do you say? Like, I'm writing poems, bro. Like, line breaks are an integral part of a poem. You can't say nothing. Like, you just gotta.
No, that's funny.
Yeah, that is really funny.
That's hilarious. But it means you're doing something right. With that kind of like feedback, I'm just like.
Someone said that my book, one of the stories in my book, had too many pop culture references. I was like, okay, cool, that's who I am. So I don't like. I'm not gonna change that. It's just not your cup of tea, and you've got to know where that line is. I think.
Yeah.
I think it's about not compromising yourself. I think for me, that's what an artist does. An artist will have a vision. And there is nothing that will compromise that vision. And I think you have to be making art for yourself first and foremost. You have to keep yourself entertained over a long period of time. Like a book can take 3, 4, 5, 6 years for it to realize itself. So you have to be working around the subject that compels you and that can sustain you for a long period of time. It also means being comfortable in your own head, reworking, reimagining worlds and scenarios, images, pictures, people, the whole nine. But then when it comes to editing, it's really about trust and it's about respecting the person who is editing your work. Not only do they have to have an appreciation for the world that you are immersed in, but you have to respect each other's mind. Because if they don't and they're trying to push you in to be a writer that you're not, then you're going to get the tension. So I kind of felt that in my experience, it's been, when I write now, I send poems to a handful of poets who I love. Like, I love their work, I love their mistakes. Like, they're bad poems, I love them. And those are the ones who I'm like, they're like, yeah, this bit's great, bit loose here, lift it up a bit here, you're too subjective here. And it's just that, and being cool, I'm gonna do it. And then taking that guidance and that instruction and then building from it. But then I also think from what Joy was saying, there's a difference between critiquing someone technically and critiquing their subject. So when I work as an editor, I don't ever, ever, ever infringe or encroach on somebody's subject. That's their thing. So if someone's writing about the queer experience in the southeast of England, that's their subject. I will say, how best can we realise that? How do we get there? What words can we put together to bring these ideas out, as opposed to like, not that idea, something else. And I think that's a bad editor. It's somebody who tries to feel they're not from that world, but they somehow feel that they have an entitlement to be able to reimagine or reorganise elements of it.
I think something that's come out that we've realised is working with people that know their role and play that position. Another part of a writer's quest, Bolu, is obviously to find stories that aren't being told or to find new ways to tell existing stories. What stories do you think are still not being told?
It's wild to me that Love in Colour is something that's almost new, something that's mainstream, that's telling fairy tales and folklore from around the world that aren't European. And I think that's such a new territory, and it shouldn't be. All of the characters, most of the characters in my stories are dark-skinned Black women, because I realise that this is really, really rare for me to read that, to see that ever. And so I think there's still so much work that needs to be done in that area.
Yeah. Joy, what about for you? What would be the stories that you think still need to be told?
Just giving opportunities to people who are generally voiceless is probably where it needs to start. I think it's really easy for industries to be like, oh, we don't hire South Asian people because they're not applying. And I think then we need to start at the bottom. We need to start in education. We need to start with things like Merky books. And I feel responsibility to focus on young people and mentoring and opening doors, if I can, for young people that look like myself and young people in disadvantaged backgrounds. I think that it's voiceless people that haven't been able to get out of their environment and know that they are allowed to enter these industries.
As a songwriter as well, one of the big privileges of being able to write is being able to tell your story.
Yeah, that's
right.
That's how I use my music.
How important is it to you to kind of own your narrative?
It's the most important thing. Like, that's why I started music. I didn't have anybody. People called me Pocahontas. That was the only person like I could relate to on TV. Do you know what I mean? Like, and MIA, because she's Sri Lankan, my family Bangladeshi. Like, we didn't talk about therapy. We didn't talk about depression. I suffered massively from mental health issues. I still do. And like, I thought diaries were wet. I thought they were so wet, so I wrote songs instead, and that was it. I didn't think that I'd be in a job. Like, even for me to talk about what I do is so odd to me. Yeah. Because I have massive imposter syndrome. I'm like, oh my God, how did this happen? I'd never thought I'd be in this industry ever. I never thought I'd be a musician. I thought like it was chosen people that were raised from birth to become musicians. So I think my narrative is extremely important to me because it's the thing that has been the reoccurring theme and the denominator through my entire career. Yeah. It's the thing that's driven me. It's the thing that I have a voice. I want to use it so badly all the time. And when I'm not doing it right, or when I feel like I'm not putting myself in the right environment, I actually find that that's when I get low. So I'm super attached to being able to keep my narrative and keep saying what I feel I need to say. Yeah.
Bolu, Joy's spoken there about obviously owning her story. You spoke about the characters that you write being characters that you want to see more of. How important is it to you then to use your writing to tell a story that is reflective of who you are?
Yeah, I think it's really important for me to write stories where women are tough, but the toughness does not negate their softness or vulnerability, where they're intelligent and they're really, really attached to who they are and getting to know who they are. I think actually in a lot of the stories, knowing who they are and their journey to realising their power is part of the romance for me. And the romance with their partner is kind of sweetens the deal, but it's not the deal. It accentuates what they already know of each other. And I think it's really important for women, especially Black women, to know that they are entitled to love, and they are entitled to a love that embraces them and elevates them, and entitled to a love that is safe enough for them to be soft within. And I think a lot of women feel like there's a dichotomy, that we should either be strong or we're weak. And they don't know that the two can be twined, and softness is not necessarily weakness, actually. So for me, it's so important to be able to write women like that, because those are the women I know, these women who are really, really dynamic.
Anthony, do you think there are particular stories from your perspective that aren't being told or that you feel should be explored more?
100%, but it's that stories are a broad spectrum as a people, and I think a lot of this industry comes back to power and who the gatekeepers are, who are the people commissioning, who are the commissioning editors. We talk about music industry, who's A&R, who's doing the signings. And I kind of think we're living through a period at the moment where we are seeing a cultural shift in what we put a focus on. Numbers of kind of people of colour writing books in different genres is going up significantly since the last 5-6 years, which is a lot of the push that has come from writers and artists wanting to be represented and wanting to feel seen within the literature milieu. So these things are massively important. I come from a Cypriot background, so like there's 250,000 Cypriots in the whole UK. So we are a minority within a minority, right? Like most of them are in London. So I kind of feel that when we talk about stories, talk about voices, we talk about experiences, it's really important to have a landscape that acknowledges everything as well as it can. But then at the same time, you don't want it to be tokenistic. Because when it becomes tokenistic, it means it's a fad. And in 5 to 10 years' time, we might not be here. And it will be another bunch of people sitting down talking about their stories and their voices. So what you want to try and do is consecrate ideas and people and their lives and their experiences into the tapestry of the social fabric. Like that's what you want. We're like here to stay.
Yeah, when I was doing press for Loving Colour, I got, during an interview, the person who was interviewing was not white. And they were like, Loving Colour is really of the moment, isn't it? And that made me really laugh because it's romance. Romance is the most kind of, it's forever. It's always existed. It's always been existing. So the only thing that makes this story of the moment is the fact that it features characters who are not white. Which means that your ideal of romance is white, and this is kind of like a novelty. And I don't actually want my stories to be unique. I want them to be relatable. I want them to exist forever. I don't want them to be this kind of quirky thing that people are attracted to because it's just so exotic. It should be a really natural thing, and it should be, like you said, just part of our tapestry.
Do you think you have to write with like your reader in mind? Like, do you think it's important to imagine who your reader is, or do you write for yourself?
Yeah, you do, because the reader doesn't exist. Like, you don't know everyone in the world. You don't know everyone who's going to walk into a bookshop, what they're going to take with them. For me, the best art is a canvas you project on. So you read a book and you project onto those characters. You take your experiences, your sentiments, your political leanings, everything, your trauma, and you project into that world. That, for me, is how art works. It's a utility that we use to not only navigate the world, but we navigate ourselves and understand ourselves in relation to these characters, which are symbols of other representations within the world. So I kind of feel that trying to second guess your reader's like imaginative capacity is a completely futile endeavour. Like, you don't know what people are capable of doing.
Yeah, and I think it can make your work really contrived because you're not really, exactly like you said, you're not writing true to yourself. And the reader is a phantom idea, but your work is real and what you're doing is real. And the people who gravitate to it, that's your reader. So I think it's not your responsibility to think, who is this going to attract? It's your responsibility to write a true piece of art, to create something that's true to yourself and true to your experiences.
Joy Bolu said that she writes for herself. Do you find that in music you're writing the songs that you want to hear?
Not necessarily. I think that it's a canvas and I don't want to overthink it, and I don't want to be like, I'm going to love this afterwards, because I feel like automatically you put pressure on yourself. Being authentic is really important in getting that end product, and also not thinking about the end product is probably the most important part of that process for me.
Well, we've spoken about how you guys create and how you approach writing. I'd love to know if there's a book or a song that you wish you wrote.
Because there's so many, I'm just going to go with the most recent example. And the book is called Luster by Raven Leilani. And it's so honest and so bracing. And you can tell she wrote this with such freedom. And it's really, really brutal. And sometimes it's a difficult read. But it's also really funny and really, really exact and really, really precise in the words she uses, with whilst also being poetic. And I think being able to balance that emotion with clarity and with honesty is something that I'm always kind of striving within my work.
Anthony, what about you? Is there a book or a poem that for you is near perfect?
Yeah, I mean, I read stuff every week that makes me want to never write a thing again. Like, you just feel unqualified. I think I'm attracted to people's minds, the way that they distill the world, the way they think about the world. And I think there are poets who have a particular way of taking massively complex, tenuous issues and synthesizing them in a way that, for me, gives me a perspective. And taking all that in whilst creating a philosophy out of it is really impressive. And the Americans have got a way, the American poets, for me, I read a lot more Americans than what I do British, mainly because the market is 5 times the size as what we are here, and the talent pool is huge over there because of the kind of infrastructure that they have to support burgeoning poets. So I read books by Terence Hayes, Jericho Brown, Mary Ruefle, Peter Gizzi, Sharon Olds, Ilya Kaminsky, and all day long I'm just like, whoa, how do you do that?
And what about you, Joy? Is there a song that for you wish you wrote because it is, to you, the perfect example of songwriting?
Someone asked me this recently and I said Sign of the Times by Prince.
Oh, yeah?
I think it's just such a brilliant song. And like you said, he's taking really heavy topics and just going, Sign of the Times. And it's just like, how did you get there?
Incredible.
It's a particular calibration of language, I think, with songwriting in particular, because it's being set to music. The language operates differently from like traditionalism, like traditional poetry, because you've got the minds, it's being stimulated in a whole load of different ways because it's set to music. Whereas if you strip the music back and you just examine the lyrics on their own, a lot of the time, John Lennon's Imagine, it's like a little nursery rhyme. But when you hear it sung, you hear it put to music with the kind of the texture of the voice put on top, same with Prince, Michael Jackson, whoever it is that you want to talk about, there's always a way in which removing, even rap lyrics, like you remove the rap.
No, rap is different though. When I read anything Kendrick Lamar does, I literally have to take a walk outside my living room, just gather myself and come back in.
Even as an author, Kendrick Lamar is so inspirational to me. Just what he does with the language.
Incredible.
But do you think Kendrick Lamar's work could live without Kendrick Lamar?
Yeah. It's amazing.
What do you mean?
So basically the idea is... No. The idea is that if you're in a bookshop and you're scanning the shelves and there's a book there, it's by poems by Kendrick Lamar. Kendrick Lamar is not a rapper. It's Kendrick Lamar has written a book of poems. You open it.
I'd buy it.
Absolutely.
I genuinely think it could. Like, I could read Kendrick Lamar all day.
It's the best.
All day. I learned so much.
Even his ad-libs are like, that was educational.
Exactly.
I read him more than what I've listened to him. So I would just go and read the lyrics online.
So you consume the lyrics in that way?
Yeah. I used to write poetry when I was younger, and like, a lot of people, when they read my book, they say that, oh, there's a musicality to it, there's a lyricism to it, because that is really where I get so much of my inspiration from. Just the rhythm of language, and the rhythm, there can be rhythm in prose, and the rhythm within emotion is so important to me. So when I write, language is as important to me as feeling. And I think, that's why I just adore Kendrick Lamar and could just read him all day, because I learned so much about his use of language and rhythm, and
very
incredible genius.
Joni Mitchell as well. Her lyrics are like stupid.
That whole era though, like that period in particular, was so heavy on lyrics. Like if you think about from like the Motown period to soul to the Marvin Gaye, like that whole thing, there was, because of the proximity that those, particularly the New York singer-songwriters had to New York poets, the James Baldwins and the whatever else, like because they were living in close proximity, everyone was vibing off everyone.
Yeah.
Which is why you get it.
You can hear it. It's incredible.
So do you think it's harder to be a writer now? The accessibility is completely different. So in that era, Joni Mitchell, you're only consuming really the cream of the crop, whereas now you're kind of saturated in content. There are so many ways to consume books.
I think the difference is that we're consuming now the legacy of that period, whereas now we are in this period. So in 50 years' time, we're going to see who stays from that.
Yeah.
Whereas we're in a period now where we're looking back into the 70s and we're thinking, right, these are the people, these are the artists that have made it into the future, basically.
There's definitely a level of romanticising it as well, because I always deep that. I'm always like, I bet Basquiat was just walking down the road and Andy was like, what are you saying? And Edie Cedric was like, hi. And like, you just don't get that here in Shoreditch.
I guess we forget that there was a whole load of artists that were working, painters, poets, musicians, novelists, that were all working from the 50s, 60s and 70s that no one will ever hear of.
That's what I was going to say. That's literally what I was going to say.
Anthony, is there a piece of advice or just a gem that you take with you that was given to you by either another writer or anyone in your life?
I have each kind of piece of advice, these little aphorisms like stuck on the walls of my head that I just go to whenever I need them. But the thing that I go back to the most is I just tell myself, be about the work. That's it. Be about the work. Like everything else that we've discussed, how it's received, rejections, praise, accolades, whatever it might be, nothing to do with you. Your job is to sit at that desk and make something that didn't exist before. That's it.
Be about the work. Love that. Joy, what about you? Is there a piece of advice that you've received that kind of informs the way you work?
Like I read something a couple of years ago, and there's a quote by Nick Cave, and he said that music is jewellery for people's minds. Ooh. And I was like, you're so right. It's really not that deep, and it is that deep at the same time. And I love jewellery personally, so like there's some jewellery that feels like I connect with my ancestors with, and there's others that's just from Claire's accessories, you know what I mean? So, so I go back to that sometimes when I'm overthinking.
That's a nice quote. Bolu, what is the piece of advice or the gem or the quote that you carry with you as a writer?
Oh, there's just so many. Basically anything that Chimamanda says, I'm like soaking up. But what I do learn from Chimamanda herself generally is just her authenticity and her honesty in her writing. Like you said, it's just about doing the work and doing the work and knowing your voice. I think it's really worth taking the time to understand who you are and understand your voice and understand what you're trying to do. Because once you do that, everything becomes almost irrelevant because you're so focused on doing that and creating what is true to you and your essence. And people will be drawn to that. If they're drawn to that, they're drawn to that. If they're not, they're not. But as long as you're writing something honest and creating something honest, that's the most important thing, I think.
Powerful and a nice way to end. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. Remember, you can grab Anthony's book on Apple Books. The links are in the description. And get in touch in the comments. Let us know what your biggest takeaway from this episode was. We'd love to hear from you.